So finally, as promised, I bring you the next series of Kamen Rider that we're going to talk about, the fourth season in the Heisei era, Kamen Rider Blade. So Kamen Rider Blade is interesting. On the surface, it's probably one of the most basic of seasons since, well, Kuga, which in itself is a basic season, but in a good way. But it has various deeper layers, which honestly makes me enjoy the series. But it's also more known for the various types of memes said series has produced. Like, a ton of Rider memes exist, with any long-running franchise, but a lot of them come from the Kamen Rider Blade. Like, the season in itself is more well known for its memes than for its actual story. So I should probably go over that story right about now. Anyway, 10,000 years ago, a battle broke out between 52 beings known as the Undead. Each of the Undead represent a different species, such as canines, felines, giraffes, obviously humans, insects of various types, and plants, to name a few. Anyway, they were fighting over dominance of the planet itself, with the winner being granted absolute dominance for them and their species. The winner of the last time this occurred was obviously the human undead, whose win allowed humanity to claim dominance over the earth, with the other undead being sealed away, never to be awoken again. And inevitably someone wakes the undead, unsealing the undead and restarting this ancient war, which is known as the battle fight. Redundant names are redundant. Anyway, in order to combat the undead and protect humanity, the idiots who unsealed them in the first place, a group known as Board, who I don't want to go into what the acronym actually means, utilized the very undead themselves to create a rider system and create two Kamen Riders, our titular Kamen Rider Blade named Kazama Kenzaki, and a secondary rider known as Kamen Rider Garen, Sakuya Tachibana. However, amidst all of the conflict going on right now, and a potential betrayal by Garen, a third mysterious rider shows up known as Chalice, with the mystery of the undead deepening as this battle fight is very different from the one 10,000 years ago, as if it's not an actual true battle fight. Like, it's not really recognized by the higher powers, aka God. And, well, none of the characters actually know what the battle fight is or specifics until about halfway through the series, so yeah. So with that statement, you can guess that a lot of the season is spent with our various cast of characters fumbling around in the dark trying to figure out what exactly is going on. And you wouldn't be wrong. It doesn't help that Board as an organization seems to collapse in the first few episodes of the season, with our remaining cast of characters basically being their refuse and trying to make this battle fight work, or at least trying to protect humanity from the undead. But Board isn't exactly on as they become the standard evil organization that pops up in all these types of series. Basically trying to monopolize the undead for their own purposes, or the purposes of the leader, who's also the asshole who unsealed them in the first place. Or at least he ordered the unsealing in the first place for his own power. Basically, he wants to attain the powers of God, because he is a crazy person. Anyway, let's talk about the Kamen Rider suits. The Blade suits are all based around playing cards, which is interesting. This is the second series to use the card motif, and the only one to actually use the motif of playing cards, with Ryuki before only using cards as a way to use the powers. Anyway, the Blade suits are all based around playing cards. Each of the 52 undead are categorized between the numbers 2 to 10, with 4 special ace category undead, and a special set of royal clubs representing Jack, Queen, King, and basically the royal flush of undeads. Oh, I said this was the 4th series? I meant this was the 5th series, my bad. Anyway, now, why would I bring up the undead when talking about suits? Well, as mentioned earlier, the rider system for the season uses the power of the undead, specifically the 4 ace category cards, to transform, and from there on to use the other cards to use different abilities and finishers, such as scanning card that's ranked 2 or so for an attack, or ranked 10 or so for a finisher, or the various king and queen cards for further finishers. Anyway, for those of you who don't know card types, the cards are categorized between clubs, hearts, spades, and diamonds, which each of the different categorization cards going under one of those different categories. I don't know specifically how those are determined. It might be based on the writer that seals them. I'm not 100% sure on that. And each of the writers representing each of those symbols themselves, such as our titular writer, Kamen Rider Blade, who's the writer of spades, using a beetle undead to transform. The suit itself is pretty cool, having a stag beetle motif with the horn coming out in the middle, which is a nice return of the bug theme, which hasn't been seen since Agito. Yes. I mean, people argue about fives, but they say that helmet's based more on a shark, so yeah, this is the return of the bug motif, which basically comes and goes every few years. Anyway, the space symbol on the chest obviously makes it obvious what type of rider it is, or at least which category of rider it belongs to. And it's a pretty simple suit overall. It's not highly complex, but that's kind of why I love it so much. It's more like knight's armor in a way, which goes on with the name Blade. It's not one of my favorite suits, even in the early Heisei era, but I ultimately coming away liking it more than hating it. I should also mention the unfortunate side effects. Basically, with time, there's been some damage over the years in some of the more recent showings that the suit's been in, particularly with the reunion movies or specials, with some yellowing around the silver faceplate and other areas across the suit. Again, this isn't uncommon. Looking at you, Gills, and later the Double suit from Kamen Rider Double. They're basically always notorious for not treating their suits very well after the series is done with production, which irritates various fans, because unless you're main rider material, they're probably not going to remake your suit. Again, here's looking at you, Gills. Anyway, fans have begun to explain some of the damage done to the suit over time, particularly the yellowing with some plot stuff that happens later on, but in real life it's just Toei being negligent yet again. Anyway, similar to the last season, Blade only has 2 power-up forms, that being the Jack form and the King form, obviously based on the name of the playing cards. No Queen form, which I would find kind of hilarious if there was one that existed. Basically, Jack form will add some wings and add some gold to the Blade suit. It's pretty cool looking and gives Blade the ability to fly, which is pretty cool. But I honestly give my hands up to Blade's final form and King form, which is one of the very few suits to pull off that gold and blue coloring that just keeps being used in a lot of final forms over this franchise. Now, go look across the franchise, especially towards the later Heisei era. I swear there's like a good 3 seasons straight where the final form the secondary rider gets are all gold and blue. It's really weird. And they always don't look great. Like, this is probably the one time this combination actually worked pretty well. Are these two supposed to be complementary colors? I don't know. I didn't study color theory. I might actually ask somebody about that for further clarification. Anyway, yeah. I also love the significance of this form, but we'll be getting into that later because this is a form that's not supposed to exist in the power set of the series. And that brings me to the person who wears the suit in Kazuma Kanzaki. When it comes to main riders, he's probably the most basic we've had in a long time. He's probably even more basic than Kuga's rider was. And again, names are escaping me at the moment. He starts off as just a salaryman who works as a Kamen Rider to basically pay his rent, even though he gets kicked out in like episode 2. And yeah, while that can lead to some interesting characteristics, such as following a strict schedule or breaking company rules that don't apply here or there, he's ultimately a good person who just wants to help and protect people. And again, at least leads him to being basic. He is somewhat conflicted about fighting the undead, particularly one undead, but it just goes to show he's a good person. which is very reiterated throughout the course of the series. The one really interesting thing about him as a character is that he has a very high pain tolerance and a weird, unexplained synchronicity with the undead that explains how he can enter king form. But outside of that, he's a very basic character. Apparently, even the suit actor didn't really have much to work with when acting as him in suit. So, yeah. Despite me kind of liking him as a character, he's probably the most basic main rider we've had, again, in some time. Probably since the Showa era. Although I'm not 100% sure because I haven't really watched the Showa era. And I should mention he's the source of a lot of the memes, thanks to the fact that I don't know specifically why, but his actor always seems to have a slur in his speech, or at least oftentimes has one. I mean, even I can tell it's there, and I basically only know Japanese from overhearing it thanks to years of watching anime and content like Kamen Rider, and yet I can overhear the slur. It's very pronounced, and I can understand why it's such a meme. Anyway, secondary writer time with Kamen Rider Garen, the Kamen Rider of Diamonds. And no, we're not making this Steven Universe joke. You can tell it's a substitute to Blade due to basically being pretty similar in their overall construction and their various look. However, it uses an opposite color scheme, using red instead of blue and having 2 horns instead of 1. Also, the weapons are opposite, which I find neat because Blade obviously uses a sword or blade, and Garen uses a sword, although I don't know where the name Garen comes from. Blade's obvious, I don't know about Garen, I might look it up later, but I probably don't have time to put it into this video. Anyway, its jack form is also similar to Blade's jack form, and that's really much all I can say about jack form. Again, this is a very much a sister suit to the main rider suit, like a lot of secondary riders around this time period, and it's pretty obvious. Now, as for the writer himself, Sakia Tachibana, he's a lot more interesting. He's somewhat struggling with being a writer due to the fact that his body is breaking down from fighting this whole time. He needs drugs to keep up and is struggling against his own personal fears of fighting. It's an interesting character arc that leads to him turn to a dark side temporarily because of being coerced by an asshole who turns out to be an undead. And, yeah, at first he seemed like he would just be the standard angsty, kind of evil secondary writer, but after his whole story arc is done with, including the death of his girlfriend, because that had to be done yet again, he changed his size to reveal he's a really good, deep person on the other side of the... he's a really good person on the other side of it all, similar to Kanzaki. He's a good person who just wants to help people, which is a very common thing in this series, at least with terms of its main writers. So, yeah. And I don't want to talk more about him because him overcoming his fears is basically a major plot point, especially towards endgame. So let's talk about our remaining 2 writers in Kamen Rider Triangle, aka the Kamen Rider of Clubs. He's technically the last writer to show up, but I want to talk about him before I talk about Chalice, because Chalice is way more interesting. Liangle's suit is a pretty cool suit, using a very different kind of rider system than the other 2, so it looks like a sister suit, but also very different, using a very dark shade of green with gold armor around it to show it might be stronger than the other 2. Yeah. Also the spider symbol on the faceplate, which basically is to show they use the spider undead, similar to how, the others have their own marks on their faces or parts of their chest to show what kind of undead they utilize, the beetle and stag beetle respectively. As for the writer himself, because Chalice doesn't get Lango doesn't get a secondary form in this series, he does have one in the figure line, which looks pretty cool. Bulky as all hell, but pretty cool. The writer himself is known as Mitsuki Kamijo, and there is another person who uses the Liangle suit, but Mitsuki's the primary user and the one that eventually tames the power of Liangle. See, the thing about Liangle is, at first, at the very beginning when he first shows up, he's only a pawn of the undead used to power the suit, the spider undead, who was sealed improperly. Like, I don't think they explained this 100% in the show, why the spider's sealing wasn't proper, because it looked proper. But anyway, the spider has a strong will and manages to control its own rider system in order to basically possess the user and control the transformation into Liangle. So, yeah, for a bulk of the series, Mitsuki has to struggle with control over his own body from the being possessing him. And it leads to a lot of, well, issues for the guy. Mitsuki struggle to overcome the evil power trying to take control of him is probably one of the most compelling plot points of the mid part of the show. And if this sounds familiar to people, congratulations, you also group of Power Rangers, specifically Power Rangers Dino Thunder, which uses the very similar plot point of having a power source be completely evil and trying to corrupt a user by taking control of them. Specifically, I'm talking about the White Dino Ranger storyline in that season. Mitsuki, as a person, is ultimately a very good kid who just wants to be a superhero after being inspired by Kazuma. He eventually does get that wish after conquering the spider undead and controlling the Liangle powers, but it takes a very long road for him to get there. And for a long time, he just looks like an angsty teenager, which he kind of is at points considering how much he's bullied in the season. Anyway, our final rider, the third one, is Kamen Rider Chalice, the Kamen Rider of Hearts. This is a vastly different suit than any other suit in the series, which makes sense considering the fact that it uses a completely different rider system. Note, the Chalice system is a system that all the other rider systems in the series are based upon, which is interesting to note. Anyway, the suit obviously has a bit of a wilder look to it than the other more controlled suits that the other riders have, using a lighter green than Liangle's green and shades of yellow. And generally, this is probably one of my favorite suits in the show, which is only topped by the power-up Chalice Wild or Wild Chalice. Obviously, it's further topped by King Form, but we'll talk about that when we talk about King Form a little bit later, more specifically plus stuff about King Form. The suit's colors are also inverted in Chalice Wild, which is a pretty cool effect, with the suit's red going where the green goes and the green going where the red used to be. Now, let's talk about the rider himself, Hajime Aikawa, if I pronounced that right. If I didn't, I'm very sorry. Anyway, he is complicated to say the least. He's someone who can naturally sense the undead, and he doesn't exactly remember his own past. He somehow has a rider system despite not being attached to the board in any way, shape, or form, and there are a lot of mysteries tied to his very nature. And, well, as we find out later in the series, it's all because he is himself an undead. Yes, he's an undead fighting the undead to win the game, using the powers of the undead to strengthen himself. And it's all very spoilery, but to say the least, Hajime's own rider system, the Chalice system as I'm going to call it here, is the basis for every rider system in the series, all based on him. So, yeah. And as to mention, because he's an undead and he can turn into a humanoid form, that also leads to some interesting implications. Now, for the undead as a whole, I generally like the idea behind them. They're an unkillable, immortal kaijin group who fight for the superiority of their own species over everything else and trying to take over the Earth, which is very different for most kaijin groups. It's also interesting because while you can't explode them, they don't exactly die from exploding, so yet again, immortal monsters that have to be sealed away, and the writers using their own powers to strengthen themselves is another really cool idea that I generally like. Using them as set power sources and potential sources of power-ups, as well as a source of new writers. And, yeah. But outside of that, the undead are a simple or unorganized group of kaijin. They don't have any other overarching goals aside from fighting the battle fight, which they often do by fighting humans, or the more intelligent undead hiding amongst humans to try to use them as various proxies for their own superiority, such as the Peacock undead. It's interesting because there are a few Templary undead who rather like humanity, but at the same time are fighting to win the battle fight for their own sake because that's their goal and that's their reason for existence, such as the Giraffe undead. Again, they're all based on different species. And yeah, there's no higher command structure to the undead. There at first appears to be one in the World Club undead. There's various king, queen, jacks, and whatever undeads. But they don't really control the undead. They just gather around and plan their own things about killing humans and trying to win the battle fight, which eventually means they have to fight themselves. And then there's things like the Kerberos undead. The Kerberos undead is one of the artificial undead that get unveiled towards the very end of the series, as created by the head of board so that he can hijack the battle fight and steal the power of God for himself. And even then, it's a pretty simple enemy to take out. It's not even the ultimate big bad, even though it's set up to be said ultimate big bad. Who's the ultimate big bad of the series? In a way, the Joker. Like any deck, there's a 53rd card in the Joker card. And this is the case here. The Joker is a failsafe for the battle fight. If the Joker wins, that means all life on the planet wasn't up to code, and, well, the battle fight resets, with all life on the planet being wiped out by the Joker's various kaijins. And, well, who is the Joker undead? Hajime. Yeah, Hajime is the Joker undead, and basically the series is big bad. As if he wins, it's basically game over for everyone, not just the humans. And as the Joker undead, he can copy the powers and abilities of the other undead in the series. Basically, all the writers are based on the Joker, which is very interesting. And that's a big warning signal, because Hajime can only be Hajime because he's using the power of the human undead, who was taken out before the series even started. And, well, there's a reason for that. The human undead basically wanted a way to permanently deal with the Joker problem, and as such allowed himself to be sealed away by the Joker to grant the mindless monster some semblance of humanity by living in his form. Also, the Chalice form is used via the Mantis undead, so that's the Category A Mantis monster. And, yeah, it all kind of worked because Hajime does grow to love and understand humanity thanks to interacting with various people, such as his caretakers, Haruka and Amane, who give him a place to stay, with Amane also being a little girl that Hajime grows close to as she sees him as a almost father/big brother figure in her life after her own father's passing. This leads to an interesting scenario that I don't think we've seen in the entire franchise. I don't even think it's shown up in Super Sentai, where one of our main characters turns out with no malice and no mind control, and without being turned into a weapon or tool by anyone else, is turned into the final boss of the season. Not just a mid-boss, not just an obstacle to face, they are turned completely into the final boss. And again, that is something that I don't think we've seen in any other season of Kamen Rider, Super Sentai, or most other Toku material, which that is interesting as hell. Hajime just wants to live a normal life alongside the people he cares for and live as a human now that he's learned to understand what humanity is. But he's just not allowed to because of his own nature as an undead and as the Joker undead. It's really cool because there's this moral conflict between our main characters, because Hajime himself wants to be taken out. He doesn't want the world to end, but everyone also sees he wants to live. Again, it's a very interesting scenario, and interesting to see how various characters play against this, especially while dealing with the threat of the other undead. Specifically that lion asshole. So, I'm going to pose you all a question. How much does a series' ending affect your enjoyment of a work? I've heard of plenty of cases of people saying that the ending to something ruined it or saved the series. Mostly ruined, as I've heard with a lot of different material over the course of years. For this series, my ultimate enjoyment of the series greatly comes from the influence of the ending. And that's not normally the case. Normally, I can forego the ending to the journey. but the journey in this case was pretty passable at best. But this ending is generally magnificent. So again, I ask you, if the journey was okay at best, but the ending was fantastic, how would that make you rate something? Like something was pretty passable all the way to Endgame, in which case it pulled off an excellent finale and final arc. Would you rate it just solely based on that ending? Or would you have to consider the entire series and drag the ending down because of it? That's one of the various conundrums I come from after watching this series. And well, I'll let you come up with your own conclusions, but let me talk about that ending, shall we? So I stated before, Hajime is the Joker undead, and if he's left alive as the last undead, he'll unleash the power that will reset the world. And he can't control it. And because of these events of the story, with the undead being taken out, and the artificial undead, and the Royal Club undead, which ultimately leads to only 2 undead being left, with one of them being antagonistic towards humanity, and leaving the writers no other choice, Hajime is the last undead left. And with the battle fight having become official by that point, there's no stopping it. And this unleashes a new force, a subset of the undead that will go out and kill all life on the earth. These dark roaches, the Joker's animal theme, because everything has an animal theme, is cockroaches. So, if you're afraid of cockroaches, imagine a world ending because of a gigantic swarm of humanoid roachmen coming to murder you. So think Terraform Mars, but less muscly ape cockroaches. And when the dark roaches are swarming the entire city, potentially the world, although we obviously don't see outside of the city, we can just infer potentially they're swarming the entire world, or maybe the city is their starting point, because that's where Hajime is. Anyway, they're swarming the city, and Hajime and the other riders struggle to stop them, with Hajime begging for death, believing that his death will end all this madness. But Kanzaki can't bring himself to do it. He can't kill Hajime, because he's a good person, and Hajime is a good person, and they're friends. And while some people will call that being stupid, in this case, Kanzaki's thinking of a longer game, potentially. Maybe he's running off emotions, but there's a longer game that could work. You see, he has a high sync rate with the undead, as they did much earlier. And this allows him to use King form. So, it's stated earlier in the series that if he keeps using King form, which he shouldn't do, but has to in order to keep up the power gap, he could potentially turn into an undead himself. And so, in the endgame, in order to protect people, in order to stop all this, Kanzaki fights. And he fights. And he fights. Until he leaves his humanity behind. Kanzaki, in one last battle with Hajime that ends in a draw, is now an undead. Specifically, he's a second Joker undead. And because there's now another undead in the game, the Dark Roaches disappear. The game's not over. The system's begun yet again, and so they're ordered to fight. But Kanzaki, he has no intention of fighting. He locks the game, stops it from ending, and keeps it on a permanent recess in order to protect Hajime and the rest of humanity. And so in order to stop this and prevent himself from giving into temptation and fighting Hajime, Kanzaki leaves, going away from all of his friends and loved ones, and trying his best away from Hajime at all cost, in order to not succumb to the instincts and fighting Hajime to bring about the end of the world yet again. It's probably one of the more horrific fates that the main character can succumb to in most fiction. He's now an immortal being who can never die, cursed with immortality, who has to stay away from the very people he's loved, because not only will they be torn away from him by the passage of time, if he's too close to them, he could potentially in the world because of a connection that he's already made. It's an interesting thought, very much so, and I honestly love this ending. My explanation does not do it justice. All the tension and build up in those last few episodes are really great, especially in that final episode, and the moment where Kanzaki truly sells his character by locking the game. That moment is what sold me on him 100%. And, well, there's also something else to consider. Board unsealed the undead, and their asshole of a leader decided to use the undead for more power. He would say someone else can't do that. This way, Kanzaki prevents the undead threat altogether and prevents anyone from using their powers ever again at his own sacrifice. Again, it's pretty deep for someone, such a very simple character, whose most defining trait was he's a good person. But when you get down to it, Kanzaki's defining trait is he's a good person. And man, did I really love this ending, as I stated earlier. Overall, Kamen Rider Blade is basic. It's a pretty basic series. It's enjoyable as hell, although the effects are very dated. Like, seriously, the effect is hard to watch at some scenes. It's enjoyable and a fun watch, but again, what stands out is that ending. Probably one of the deepest endings in all of Kamen Rider, when you look at it a certain way. It's one of the best endings and one of the deepest, and I think if any in the franchise, Mitsuki's story alone is generally great, as anyone who's seen a White Dino arc will testament to how great that story was. I honestly think this one did it better because it didn't drag out the story a bit. But yeah, it did drag out the story with the clone a bit. But this was a great story, and overall, one of the best ones in the early Heisei era to me personally. I find it interesting. The characters stumble around a bit, like Fi's, but here it feels more like they're wasting time, unlike Fi's, where no one had any idea what was truly going on, and as such, it made a bit more sense. Here, people do know what's going on, but they're left in the dark more than not, because they're used as pawns by the villains. So, I come away from this series mixed, loving the ending, but hating the middle and the beginning. Well, not hating the middle. Say the middle's pretty basic, the beginning's pretty dull, though. Overall, this is probably the most mixed and enjoyable series I've ever seen in the Kamen Rider franchise. But deep down, I still enjoyed it. I wouldn't have spent over 30 minutes talking about it if I didn't. So that's Kamen Rider Blade. I hope this will convince at least some of you to give this series a try. Maybe pick it up, watch a few episodes. I definitely recommend watching the final arc if you can just skip everything and go straight to that. So you won't get the emotional feels from it. But yeah, overall, Kamen Rider Blade's a pretty good show. Pretty great ending, pretty middle. And yeah, and just like with Five Eyes, we're not done yet because we have one movie to go through. I want to talk about this one due to its interesting if scenario and Kamen Rider Blade Missing Ace. I'll see you guys here next time for that one.